Well, welcome everybody to this live stream, which we're calling Discovery and Diversity, an introduction to the African Ancestry Neuroscience Research Initiative. We're here at the Lieber Institute for Brain Development and the Maltz Research Laboratories on the Johns Hopkins Medical Campus here in Baltimore, Maryland. And I am here, I'm Daniel Weinberger, I'm the director and the CEO of the Lieber Institute for Brain Development, and I'm here with three of my colleagues and friends to talk about this subject. I want to introduce them to you, but they'll give you a lot more information. This is Reverend Dr. Alvin Hathaway, who is the emeritus pastor of the historic Union Baptist Church here in Baltimore. Also, I should say, the man about town in this city. And he'll talk a little bit more about how much he is a fundamental part of this project. Dr. Kaf Zarasa is professor at Duke University School of Medicine. He's also a Howard Hughes Medical Institution investigator. He's been one of the seminal voices in thinking about how to bring minority communities into the neuroscience world. And last but not least is Dr. Gwenaëlle Thomas, who is the manager of research programs here at the Lieber Institute of Brain Development. So I'm very happy to open this conversation. I'd just like to say this is the first day of Black History Month, but this day is meant to introduce to all of you listening to us to what is a historic day in Black brain health, which has to do with the African Ancestry Neuroscience Research Initiative. I want to ask Reverend Al to talk a little bit about what this is, how we got this going, and what it means to the community here in Baltimore and really beyond Baltimore. Rev?
Thank you, Danny. In fact, what is very interesting is that in Baltimore we have so many luminaries in terms of civil rights. I guess one of the major luminaries is Justice Thurgood Marshall. And Justice Thurgood Marshall always was asked the question of what is equality? And equality, he defined, is that you get the same thing at the same time in the same place. And so when you think about that, and you didn't think about this whole area of neuroscience research, I came at it from the perspective of social justice, that persons of African descent should be involved, should be critically engaged, should be a part of the whole ecosystem. We should be able to get the same thing at the same time at the same place. And so that has been a kind of driver for me as it relates to involvement. So I'm just here excited to think that on this panel of amazing, brilliant scientists, you have a Baptist minister. So that is as inclusive as you could possibly be.
But as you said from day one, Reverend Al, if the community is not engaged in this from the get-go, it is already handicapped in being able to achieve its goals.
Yeah. I think that Baltimore has a very clouded history in terms of its relationship with the African American community. But I think that we, in this initiative, began right. We began to ask and engage the community. We saw the community in terms of its real segments, its real leaders. So there were real conversations with religious leaders. There were real conversations with academic leaders. There were real conversations with business leaders, all from the African American community. Mm-hmm. And what happened was we found that broke down this whole area that has been really prohibitive, which is a sense of trust. Yeah. I think when you involve people, and I kind of really see this in three elements, and I've kind of modeled this. I think the most important thing that we need to remember in terms of inclusion is what I call the 3 R's. And the 3 R's is that you, one, recognize the community, that you respect the community, and that you then seek a real relationship with the community.
Go ahead, Rev.
And I gotta have 3 points now.
Yeah, that's right.
I can't be having a sermon, I have 3 points now. So I think when you look at what we have done, it has included all of those elements. Yeah. And I think that has gotten us off in a good way, in a good place.
Kaf, you are a neuroscientist.
Yes,
You're
I am.
Really a neuroscientist.
Yeah.
I mean, can you talk a little bit about your sense of neuroscience and how it relates to the African American community?
Yeah, and even before I get started, let me just give a shout out to Dr. Tama here, who's also a professor of neuroscience at Morgan State, and I say that as a proud mentor. And oftentimes, as we look across those leading the research enterprise and the teaching enterprise, they don't always reflect the experiences of the young Dr. Toma here. So I thought it was worth taking a moment to pause and reflect on the importance of her presence as well. So I got into this for selfish reasons, and I'll just be honest, right? And I think it's important to be transparent about that. I'm a neuroscientist, I'm a psychiatrist, but I'm also a family member. And so I have a family that's been deeply impacted by brain illness. And I went to medical school, did graduate school with the incredibly selfish goal of healing my loved ones. And as I was moving forward and understanding more about these illnesses and learning more about the genetics that contribute to these illnesses, I realized that these genetic databases didn't include people who had the same ancestry as my family members. And I sort of used the word did not include to be generous. I'm feeling generous this Black History Month. But if you look at the description on these texts, they were actually excluded, right? And so it became fundamentally important to figure out ways to make sure that we were understanding all of the critical pieces of the biology and the genes and how those related to people who shared my ancestry, because there was almost no hope that any illness or treatment or cure that would come down the line would be able to help my loved ones if they weren't involved in the research enterprise from the very beginning. So I got into this out of selfishness.
Exactly right. I mean, one of the things we talked a lot about when we first started into this was that we've known for a long time that different groups across this globe have different frequencies of illnesses. They respond to treatment differently. They have different courses of illness. Some groups have very unique illnesses that other groups don't have. There's been a lot of talk, for example, about sickle cell anemia being unique to individuals of African ancestry. That wasn't an accident. It's very well understood that the mutation that led to that defect in red blood cells was a mutation that prevented people from dying of malaria. And so therefore it became a fairly commonplace mutation that characterized that group because they were living in an environment where malaria was the main reason you didn't make it to age 20. And so it was very important to pass genes on. You got to make it to age 20. And so there have been many other examples of this. We in the world of brain science have known, for example, that disorders like Alzheimer's disease may be twice as common in people of African ancestry. Stroke is more common. Parkinson's disease is less common. We don't understand any of the reasons for these variable frequencies, and understanding those differences could be a huge insight into successful treatment of not just people who have greater prevalence of the illness, but people who have less prevalence of an illness. Because all of this is trying to understand how ancestry, which is our genomes, vary in how they make brains work, how they make brains susceptible to illness, how they make brains resilient to illness. And that was built into this. One of the other things I think we've done from day one is trying to extend our reach into bringing young Black scientists into this world of research. And Guanael, you are on the faculty at Morgan State. You teach a course in neuroscience. How is that working, do you think?
I want to really highlight all the amazing things that Morgan State is doing right now. So last semester was their first semester of their new applied neuroscience master's program. And as we think about neuroscience, not just what the brain is, but also keeping up with technology. We hear about machine learning, we hear about artificial intelligence, and how all of these things are constantly coming up in our life. We hear about ChatGPT or just even simple algorithms for music, for Spotify or Apple Music. And so all of these things are now emerging in health outcomes as well. And the way that Morgan is constructing their applied neuroscience master's program is teaching health equity, teaching these very strong computational neuroscience skills, teaching also the foundation. So last semester, I was co-teaching a course, Molecular and Behavioral Neuroscience, with the program director, Dr. Christine Holman. And the great thing about the way that this program is also constructed is being considerate of our target audience. We want to make this accessible. So one of the great highlights is this is something that is virtual. We also are setting the hours to be later in the day. So the course that I was teaching was starting at 6 p.m. We're being mindful that a lot of people have other jobs. A lot of people are taking other classes. Maybe you have family obligations. And so part of science is accessibility and making things able for people to actually be involved in them so that they can get to that place where you could ask the questions.
I think brain science is very intimidating to many students. I mean, how do you help them sort of get over that intimidation? It seems so remote and so complicated. How do you do that?
She's gifted.
I know you're extremely good at it.
Let me just say, I just say that just to speak to her gift. I brought 60 students here from a high school who were there learning medical technology and medical terminology, and I directed them to Dr. G. And she immediately enthralled them. She is amazingly gifted, and I think that's the importance of what we need to do. There are gifts and talents and skills that are embedded in people. We need to bring those gifts and talents and skills, and she's exhibit A of an amazing, brilliant mind that's going to make outstanding contributions to our field.
I agree.
That's
completely.
right.
And you're bringing young people into the thrill of neuroscience.
Thank you. To your question, I think we also have to remember that for some people, science is interesting because they care about science, but a lot of people share cost sentiments as well as it is, I wouldn't frame it as selfish, but you care about the people in your life, you care about the people in your community, and when you can frame things that way, then it becomes important. It's not easy to care about amino acids. It's not easy to be excited about protein structure. But if you can frame it as this is why these drugs don't work, this is why this person is struggling really hard with depression and maybe they're sleeping all day, but this is actually not their fault, and that way the conversation can shift that this isn't just a psychology problem or things that are going wrong, just like this is laziness or you're just anxious. If you can shift the conversation and make it known that, hey, there are actual biological processes that are happening. Let's make you excited to learn about this. Or maybe you don't even have to be excited, but making, again, that information accessible, because what we see a lot of the time in science and medicine is Black people are left out of the conversation. We see it even here locally, what happened with Henrietta Lacks, of that was something that was taken from her. We see how HeLa cells are used all throughout science, but I don't know too many people who can really speak to the significance of what those cells were, or how big of a violation that this was done to a Black woman and taken from her while she was in the midst of getting cancer treatment. And so there's a lot to acknowledge, and trying to bridge that gap of maybe you're not excited, but this is still important to know. Or if you are excited about this, let's relate it to topics that affect you and your family member and your community, so that you can be empowered to say, I understand how antidepressants work, or I can see that this is misinformation about COVID.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm a psychiatrist, right? So I love to name experiences. So I use this term selfishness because in some ways I want to normalize this as a human experience, right? We are programmed to do sameness, right? We're programmed to feel comfortable around sameness, whether that's young folks not want to hang out with old folks like me, or somebody in one city rooting for your team and not rooting for another team. We are just programmed as human beings to do sameness, right? And so it's a fundamental part of who we are. And I think it's important for us to name that and acknowledge it. Otherwise, you don't have a good sense of how we ended up where we are, right? At the same time, we know all throughout biology, a species does better when it's different, right? And so when there's differences, the species can tolerate all sorts of threats that come along from the environment, right? And so we as humans have thrived on this planet because of our differences of humans all across the planet. And so our job is to figure out how to balance both of these things, right? The fact that we love sameness, right? Sameness is driving me to save my family members. And I'm sure anybody out there, if you've ever had a family member that has been sick, or a child that's been sick, or grandmother that's been sick, you understand how powerful of a motivator it is to address issues that affect sameness, right? But as a species, it's learning about these differences that'll actually help us learn how to help all of us thrive, right? And help all of us do better. So here we're focused on bringing a different type of sameness into the study of biology. And we hope that those insights might help all of us to thrive.
I think that's a key, absolutely key element in this thing. Maybe I should mention, Rev,
Yeah.
one of the things that you've been at the forefront is connecting the community to this project. And you've done that by bringing in people who have provided material support for the project.
Yes.
Do you want to mention a little bit about the success you've had in making this something that the community is actually invested in?
Well, first, thank you, Dr. Kaff, because you really touched the part with me, and that I think should be just stated. I had a older brother who had mental illness growing up, and we cared for him as a family. And I always wondered, could there something have been done? Could there have been some treatment? Could there have been some methodology that could have provided a different outcome? And so this whole area of brain science, this whole area of neuroscience became a curiosity for me. And then when I came to find that we had this amazing facility here right within Baltimore, where you had amazing scientists doing research on the human brain, I just said, I need to get involved. And it did. That was a motivator for me, was that my family member, and I have to admit that. But then yesterday I had a call. I got a call from a very significant person in the community who was talking to me about her husband. Been married for 30-some years. Her husband goes into the refrigerator. He doesn't drink coffee, but on this particular day he grabs the coffee creamer and drinks it, all of it. And she's saying, what's going on? What's happening? Come to find out that he's now experiencing dementia. And she has to place her husband in hospital care. And so this area that I'm finding that it's important for us, one, to have conversations. I think it's very important that we accelerate and ensure that the research is inclusive, because there are people out there who are hurting. There are people out there that's caring for family members. There are persons wondering, can something be done? And I think it's incumbent upon the research community in a very inclusive way, in a very comprehensive way, to help them provide answers and solutions to their family problems. Now, given that, I just realized that Baltimore is an amazing, resilient city. And it is not as disorganized as people think it is. It is not disorganized. It is very organized. But the important thing is that you have to tap into the self-interest of people in the community to show that there is a mutual benefit for being engaged. And so, yes, we were able to have conversations in political circles, and we found that we got tremendous support from the governor in terms of investing in this program. We talked to one of the leading African-American businessmen in this community, and they made a commitment and invested in this. We talked to one of the largest philanthropies in the community, and they came and made the initial catalytic investment in this. But people don't realize that they kind of think and look at the community as competing interests, and it's really not. This is a community where you'll find leaders who are really invested in improving the quality of life. And I think we've got to change the conversations, that we don't pit one against another, but have conversations that include people to say that it is of mutual interest that we have a healthy society. It's of mutual interest that we have robust and inclusive research. And it's very important that we develop the next generation of talent. And so for me, as I moved among the community sharing that message, I received no resistance. The resistance that I did get, if any, is that people were suspicious that the research was for what benefit.
Yeah.
And I think that it's important for us that we articulate
Yeah.
that the research will benefit you and benefit your community and benefit your interests.
Yeah, I don't want to do anything to minimize the good role of the Reverend doctor here, who is blessed with an incredible sense of humility, right? Dr. Tomar here just expressed the history of Henrietta Lacks, right? And this complicated relationship between those who have lived in Baltimore and the medical institutions here in Baltimore, right? And as we talk about trust, there is historical reason to have distrust, right? And so that distrust has to be overcome, and it has to be overcome through leadership. And so we all appreciate the role of leadership that you've played in bringing those entities together, right? I mean, you think historically we're talking about cancer cell tissues,
Wow.
right? And what we are asking people to do is to let us get at their brain, right? And so and that access to that tissue, that after one passes away, access to that tissue is critically important to understanding what is happening, why they're picking up the milk, why they're drinking it, and where the dementia is coming from. But somebody has to be able to tell the story. And somebody has to have trust with the community to bring them in the research enterprise. And somebody has to fit those pieces together. Even if it's born out of a place of love for family, which I love to call selfishness, somebody still has to take that and bridge the gap. So I don't want to, for all of those out there, thinking about how do I do this in my community and how do I do this in my space, right? You have to take real lessons from the leader that we have here, because it's not going to be led from those teaching in the class or those sitting there doing experiments in the lab. It has to be led through leadership in the community, and so we're grateful to you.
Well, I would say to you that the important thing there is that there is accountability. And I think accountability leads to the fact that the community must be engaged, the whole research accountable, but research has to be accountable to the community to ensure that it addresses their real needs. Now, it is for people who grew up in the community, and I've been in the community for now in terms of decades. There was a time when it was dark, you definitely didn't walk past some hospitals because there was a sense that there were body snatchers. I mean, and that was very real, what people perceived of that. And then you just had a recent admission coming from the Smithsonian that they had body, human parts that may not have gotten, using all the proper protocols to receive.
And even to this day, there was a recent story about prisoners who are passing away, their body parts being taken out and used in medical schools to learn. So, yeah.
So I think it's very important that we have these kinds of conversations, that these kinds of conversations expand and include the key critical research centers in America and the world. Because you cannot have first of all, this is Black History Month, so I come from a sense of pride. People of the melanin that I have are the original humans, and so we come with a sense that we were the ones that blessed humanity with our genetic protoplasm. And I think that it's important that those persons that have that unique perspective in terms of development of the human origin are the ones that make the contributions, because those contributions will bless everyone because they have that sense of originality. And Danny says it well, Dr. Thomas also recognizes it well, that for those of us in the community, we have to have a sense of pride in who we are, because we were uniquely designed and uniquely blessed. But at the same token, there are some forces that want to minimize that. They want to distort that. They want to say that our history does not matter, when in fact it really does, because it contributes to the fabric of our society.
I just have to say, Kath, because leadership, you have been an instrumental leader in expanding the consciousness of the African ancestry neuroscience research beyond Baltimore. And you've been a voice that has brought in many people quite a distance. Reverend Al mentioned the support that we got within Baltimore for initiating this, which included the Able Foundation here. Reverend Al got people from the state government to provide a supplementary allocation, almost unheard of, for a supplementary allocation from the state of Maryland budget to support this particular science project. And Kath, you were responsible for bringing the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative here, which has now also been supporting this initiative. And you've been a voice that's been very articulate in talking about why there has to be brain science to understand how brain illnesses vary across populations. It wouldn't have happened without your contribution. Let me make a comment, because there's also this article that's been a lot of news about the Smithsonian that was, stealing brains from people without consent, etc. That's not what happens here at the Lieber Institute for Brain Development. I just need to say a little bit about how we convinced you, I think, really, and Kath.
Exactly.
I mean, I think, quite frankly, Guanael didn't need a lot of convincing.
Well, we needed her inside the tent, so we
needed
could be certain.
We needed her, but she got it from the beginning. I think Kath got it too, but we knew, and you mentioned, Kath, from all these mammoth genetic studies that have been going on since the Human Genome Project was first reported in 2002, millions and millions of people looking at how genes account for anybody's variable susceptibility to Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, autism, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression. As of about 3 or 4 years ago, when we first had these conversations, and these millions of people in these genetic studies, there wasn't one person of African ancestry in any of these big studies. So they were finding genes that were associated with these illnesses, and this was on the heels of President Obama's initiative for personalized medicine, which was based on the idea that one size doesn't fit all for who gets sick, how it looks when they get sick, how they respond to treatment, who doesn't get sick. And the reason there was differences was because of genomes, environments, lifestyles. That's what made it personalized. But the genomes were the building blocks of the whole structure. And that was not for all persons. That was by definition. This was personalized medicine for all persons. So we at the Lieber Institute for Brain Development study how genes are turned on, turned off in human brains. And if you want to study brain disorders, you really have to study the brain. You can't do population studies and come up with a lot of statistics. If you want to understand what any of this is meaning to how a brain is built, how it develops, and how it functions, you got to study brains. So we have a group here that have been doing this for a long time. We get donations of people who donate brains for biomedical research. These are not taken. These are consented for research. And over the years, we've been doing this now for over 20 years, we've gotten over 700 African American families that donated brains of their next of kin for research. And interesting enough, and this is partly by using the same logic you talked about, which is how you make people believe this is in their interest. Because we're trying to level the playing field in understanding how brain disorders differ across populations. So we had all this brain donations, but nothing was being done with it. And we know that Alzheimer's disease may be twice as common. We know that many psychiatric disorders are thought to be more common. Response to treatments are not the same. And if you want to understand this in terms of how the brain is, you got to study these brains. No one was doing this. In fact, in the world of neuroscience research, all the many, many publications on brains, less than 5% of the brains in these studies were individuals of African ancestry. And we came to you and we said, we have to level this playing field. We understand that the reason we want to study brain disease across different ancestries is not only to make personalized medicine appropriate to all persons, but because this will help us understand brain disorders even for the people not of African ancestry.
You know, one of the things is that I clearly saw it as a social justice issue. And I think that my sense of social justice says, do I picket? Do I stand outside with a picket sign and picket? But I think the evolution of social justice says that you sit at the table and you negotiate, and you begin to work, and you begin to understand, and you try to make change from within. And so for me, one of the I think the significant contributions that Lieber has made to my sense of trust is that you were able to reach down to Duke and bring onto your staff Dr. Thomas. And I think that her capacity and ability to, one, translate language of science into language that I can understand was a major contribution. And so I just think that her work and her contribution really adds to value plus. And she needs to get in and just share her work with Blacks in Neuro and all of that other work that she has done that helps us to understand in the community, this, translating this language.
Talk a little bit about the Black and Neuro story.
I'll talk about Black and Neuro shortly, but I wanted to bring up something with the social justice and research accountability first, because I think it all ties in. So even when we think about the types of questions to ask, I think something that makes the ANRI initiative so unique is the fact that we do have these community engagements, the fact that we do have this partnership with Morgan State. And when we think about how research is funded in the first place, I think as scientists, a lot of the time we like to say science isn't political. Science is political. We fund things disproportionately based on who's interested in it. But who's interested in it comes down to who it affects most, but not even who it affects most, who we think it affects most. Earlier you were talking about sickle cell. We know that sickle cell disproportionately affects people of African ancestry, but that does not correlate to high research funding. Even when we think about institutions like the NIH, the National Institute of Health, that has billions of dollars, we can look at how many HBCUs are getting research funding. We can think about how many people are even getting the resources to ask the questions to help the communities that need the help. And so I think all of that goes full circle when you were talking about our consenting process for the brain donations. Last year when we did a panel at Morgan State, this was for the RCMI Morgan Cares program, and Danny and Rev Al were both sharing how we do this consenting process, and there was a woman in the audience who was talking about her husband who had unfortunately passed, and she received a call about if she would be willing to donate her husband's, I think, liver or kidney. And she was so outraged. She was like, how dare you ask for this in this time of vulnerability? I'm grieving. It seemed very exploitative. And part of the reason why is, again, this medical racism history, this history of feeling like people are out to get you, a long history of people actually being out to get you, and also not being included in conversations. And so people don't know about our consenting process. People don't know about the fact that we are trying to overcome a very long history of exclusion, a very long history of thinking of Black bodies, Black people as disposable, or just ways to practice for research, because we see it in all different aspects of science. We think about the whole field of OB-GYN that was started off Black women without anesthesia. So there's a huge history of what we need to overcome, and I think that's why it's so important to have that accountability in research, that we are funding things with health equity in mind, that we are trying to make sure that the people who are at our partner institutions like Morgan State and other HBCUs are getting the funding. There are over 100 HBCUs, and there's not a single one that has the R1 research accreditation for that high level of funding from NIH. And that's something that Morgan is also working on as well. And I think that's also part of what we're doing with ANRI, of trying to get these different research questions going on. And then now full circle back to Black in Neuro, we saw that there was a gap for the training environment for Black trainees. There's a really high attrition rate of Black scientists who end up leaving. I'm technically included in that. I'm not doing a postdoc, sorry, cough, but it's like
more important what you're doing. It's more important what you're doing.
The training environment is terrible for a lot of Black trainees. Last year alone, there were 3 people that I knew of personally who died by suicide while in the midst of their training program. So when we're thinking about what research is, we have to also remember that people are coming with their full lives. People are coming to the lab and research is already difficult, and then you have training environments where sometimes you have people who won't even acknowledge your presence, who won't share resources with you. And that is why Black in Neuro was created. So in the summer of 2020, July 2020, our founding president, Angeline Duke, sent out a message on social media. This was following up with previous programs, so Black Birders. There was, excuse me, I'm forgetting the name right now, but there are a lot of other Black in X programs. And we saw that there was a void in neuroscience to have a nurturing training environment so that people could even feel the motivation to keep going to lab. This was also the plight of seeing social media really highlighting how racist things were, police brutality, all of these things. And this was, of course, affecting people. This was also now pandemic. And you had all of these different factors that was really contributing to how effectively you can do research. And all of this is intertwined. It's not just, I am a scientist. I'm a scientist who comes from a community that maybe has more problems or different problems than other people, but that doesn't mean that I shouldn't be nurtured and cared about in this academic environment.
You know, one of the things that we've tried to do in the African Ancestry Neuroscience Research Initiative is open the door to scientists, not just in Morgan State, but around the country, who want access to data, access to brain information. We're going to be generating over the next year. So the first major research report from what we call the ANRI should be out this month. It's going to be a very dramatic story with insights about brain disease based on African ancestry, both brain susceptibility disease and resilience from disease. There's no good or bad. It's very important to realize this. You mentioned this, Kath, about, the sameness. Most of us are the same in all, there's tiny little differences, but they account for small differences in physical appearance. They account for small differences how our immune system works. We know that COVID had different effects on people of different backgrounds, had something to do with their immune systems. These cells that make up all the cells in the body are slightly tuned differently by what we call ancestry, which is our genomes, the mosaics of all these people in our long lineage tracing way back when. So we need to understand how this variation relates to brain disorders, and I think we need to bring in many more people to work on this. Ideally, I always used to say, and I know, Kath, you know this very well, but the best way for an investigator in science to really get to the bottom of something is when it really matters to them. They gotta. You've said this about and you've said it. You gotta really care about this, and there's no question that this is an urgent, important thing to understand how. Where people's ancestors were, and all their little genome fragments that became each of our genomes contributes to what likely diseases we may get, what diseases we won't get. It's very important that one of the discoveries in this latest research is there's no such thing as a better brain. Right. It's very important to appreciate that. Yes. And you mentioned this, Reverend, when we first started talking about this. There's no such thing. Everybody's brain has a lot of things about it that give it an advantage, and everybody's brain has some things about it that's not particular advantage. And as you said, Kath, we are an incredibly diverse species, which is why we're still around.
But I think you should say something, because I want the audience to realize, because what drew me really to this honorary work, this African Ancestry Neuroscience Research Initiative work, was that I discovered that Danny is my brother. We are 99.9% the same. And I think we need to tell the people that, because there's a lot of polarization around our difference, and not a lot of coalescing around our sameness.
But there's an old saying about differences, which is that people who we call African Americans or people of African ancestry, who trace their lineage to Africa in the last 300 to 400 years, are the most genetically diverse population of people on the planet. And one of the, the scientific arguments about this concept of race is that there's nothing racial about people who are genetically so diverse. The principle of race has always been that there was something, very constrained about their variation. It's not true, because individuals in Africa have a much more longer generational history. There's more variation that emerged in the genomes. We've all lived this in real time with COVID.
Yeah.
The longer COVID's been around, the more different forms of it have emerged. That's what happens in evolution. The longer something can have new generations, the more likely it generates diversity. And people of African ancestry are the most diverse, genetically diverse people on the planet, because their generational history is much, and as we talked about this a lot. Kath and I wrote a paper a couple of years ago, and we made the point in that paper that we talk about individuals of African ancestry, but we're all of African ancestry. It's just that some of us emerged in a particular time frame in the last 100 years. But everybody's of African ancestry. That's where modern humans came from.
As we talk about this idea, right, I think on the one hand, it's important to say, like, we are all human beings. We are all of equal value, and in that we are the same, right? What worries me a lot of times in science, this idea of saying we are all the same leads to sort of this perspective of, I don't see color, right? And the problem is nature sees color, right? But nature also has a lot of other senses. So it can taste, it can touch, it can smell, it can hear, and it has friends that can also taste, touch, hear, and smell, right? So there's a lot of ways it gets information about what is different, right? And Dan made a point earlier, and I think it's easy for folks at home to really miss this point. And he talked about the original human genome, right? So it was this promise that we will understand the human genes, right? And the first version of the human genome, he said it didn't represent everybody, right? And so we've since made a lot of progress, right? And we now have what's called a pan-genome, right? And I just want him to just briefly explain sort of what's the difference between this pan-genome that tells us more about the genomic architecture maybe of African ancestry and the original genome that we had, and what the difference is, and then I'll make it a little more concrete.
Important.
I think, your point about diversity is what this is all about. So there was this human genome, which was a huge achievement. Huge achievement, theory of relativity, penicillin, it's a huge achievement to have this blueprint, the parts list, as people say, of building a human being. And it was very difficult to achieve this at that time. The technology then took 10 years. Now it could be done in a few days to build the genome, but it took 10 years, and it was a major achievement, but it was based principally on one person. It was 70, there was a bunch of people who contributed some piece of DNA, but 70% of that human genome, which became the basis for all genetic research for most of the next 20 years, was based on one person who was principally of European ancestry. There was some African ancestry, but it's principally European ancestry. And over the next 15 years or so, the updating of that genome was really based on changing variation in the genome based on European ancestry. The pan-genome was an idea to say, so this is just before we get to that, there was a professor here at Johns Hopkins who published in 2000 the first pan-genome of African Americans. And he did the DNA sequence of 900 African Americans and assembled it into what is a pan-genome, because instead of it being the genome of one person, it's putting together all the variation in the genome of 900 African Americans. And when he did that, he discovered that a tenth of that genome, 10% of that genome assembled as a cumulative sum of the 900 African Americans individuals, 10% of it was literally missing from the reference human genome.
So I was hoping you'd make that point, just so I can put this in perspective in ways that people can feel and find really concrete, right? So we have 23 what is called chromosomes, right? You all have heard of 23andMe, right? So 23 chromosomes, of which you get one from one parent and one from another, right? So 46,
Right.
right? 10% of 46,
Right.
about 4,
Right.
right? 5% is about 2,
Right.
and 2.5% is about 1, right? The difference in for all of us that argue, right, that like your primary sex characteristics matter,
Right.
they come from one chromosome,
That's
right?
right.
Whether you go XX
Right.
or XY, right? So we're talking about 10% missing,
Right.
It's a lot of information in a
and
chromosome.
and a chromosome,
Right.
2.5% of your chromosome determines all of your what we call primary sex characteristics.
Wow.
So this is why having an inclusive,
Yes.
scientific genomic architecture in the brain that represents the community and that the community trusts matters.
Now, but here but how, if in fact we know that, Cav, what do we ensure? What do we need to do to ensure as a community that the research that is emitted includes all of us?
Yeah. Well, one, you need initiatives like the African Ancestry Neuroscience
That's why we
Research
do it.
Initiative, right?
Yeah.
And you need the community advocating for this, right? And you need a publicly funded research enterprise that cares about this. The NIH has made tremendous investments, right? So there are initiatives like All of Us and other initiatives in which they're working on building relationships with the community, making sure that the genomic architecture is more representative. But you need advocates and you need scientists who care and scientists who want to make this relevant for their family. And you need scientists who are working on training up the next generation of people who will bring questions and do the work and publish the work and have trust with the community, right? This effort is centrally important to achieving that.
And also, as you said, Kathy, you have to make people understand this is really something good for them, that the community will benefit from this science. It's not to take, well, it's not to take advantage.
Yeah.
It's not to diminish the role of any population. It's to advance the health
Yeah.
of all populations.
Yeah.
That's the big irony of it. People have more slowly but surely come to realize that only by studying diverse populations will we understand human illness of any type.
Yeah, and I just want to say, right, I am so hopeful, right?
too.
I got connected with y'all 4 years ago, right? And just to think about where we were 4 years ago, I've known Dr. Thomas a little bit long
Sure.
before she was a doctor.
Right.
But 4 years ago, when I heard about this, right, within 3 or 4 months,
Yeah.
we were all closing our homes. We had seen George Floyd murdered on TV, right? And all of these challenges in our society that have been there forever were so clear and bare for us to see. And we're sitting here 4 years later, after talking about this, having some wonderful efforts in raising funding for this, having some brilliant scientists, including here at Lieber, lead this work, on the cusp of releasing our first set of findings,
Wow.
right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I think there's just tremendous hope in what the community, the science arena, and folks like yourself, the change and transformation that we can bring forward, right? So I want everyone to really leave here with the sense of the challenge is massive, but oh my gosh, is there hope, right?
Yeah.
And there's so much we can do to lead this
So
transformation.
I think when everybody out there, keep your eyes open, because the first major research publication from the AANRI effort will be out very soon, hopefully within the next few weeks. It's really quite an educational story that'll teach us a lot that's relevant to human health. I also want to remind everybody to look, there's a website, aanri.org, which will constantly be updating, so you might want to go to it. I just have to say that being part of this effort has been one of the most meaningful things I've done in my scientific career, because we are now really beginning to crack this impenetrable barrier of making, medicine relevant to all persons. And I can't thank my colleagues here enough for making this possible.
Well, I would say that you have been a part of our continuous education.
Likewise.
And the most significant education that one can have is that we learn about yourself. And then you also learn about how you can improve humanity, and you've helped me do that quite honestly.
Can you give us those 3 R's again? I want to listen. I got to take some from here. I can use.
Take that. I've used it. I just think important that if we're going to ensure that we have inclusivity in research, we have to one first recognize that there are subject matter experts with subject matter expertise different than our own. The second thing we have to do is we have to respect the fact that that subject matter expert and that information is important to our own development and our own research protocols. And then the third thing is that we got to really actively seek to have a relationship, because one of the things that I've learned about this process is that it is not a quick fix. You've got to, once you get in it, you've got to realize that you've got to stay in it, because it takes time to make change. And you've got to invest in it. You've got to use quality to make it happen, and that's what I've seen. So, if we want a microwave a fix, it's not going to happen. Yeah. This is slow cooking.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? This is marinating.
Yeah.
You know,
Go ahead, Pastor.
This is what we do, because you want to have a sweet aroma that we have created change in the research field, and we do it that way.
Thank you all for being with us.
Yeah. Thank you.